Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce my countryman, friend, distinguished Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Adelaide, South Australia, and also Director of the Centre of Military and Veterans Health at the University of Adelaide Node. Professor McFarlane's research career in this area began with the investigation of the effects of Australian bushfires on children and adults, and has continued in the area of military psychiatry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barry. I'm going to be talking about, in fact, the follow-up of these children that I studied after the Ash Wednesday bushfires today. But looking at the news last night and what's been happening in Greece at the present time, I guess creates a context very similar to that which was the population which I studied or began studying in 1993. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is a much more, I guess, theoretical issue in terms of intervention. In particular, obviously, cognitive behaviour therapy is based on the view that the cognitive schemas that people have drive the symptoms in the disorders which they develop. And what I'd like to talk about today is about a population that we first collected data on 21 years ago and have followed them up into adulthood, and the extent to which the cognitive schemas have been driven by these experiences from childhood, and the extent to which these cognitive schemas particularly predict depression. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on depression is because we tend to speak a great deal about post-traumatic stress disorder following these sorts of events, whereas often, in fact, the more common condition is major depression. Now, obviously, the role of schemas in depression is extremely well known to anybody who works in the field. However, one of the points, I think, when one looks systematically at the research, that in many of the conclusions and generalisations which have been developed, in fact, come from treatment-seeking samples rather than from epidemiological samples. And equally, the longitudinal examination of the role of childhood adversity and parenting style in determining these schemas hasn't been looked at a great deal. Most of the studies have depended upon retrospective methodologies, which obviously is very prone to contamination by people's current symptoms, because obviously if you're depressed, you're likely to remember all the bad things that happened to you and think your parents were terrible. Anybody who's got children know that that's always the case anyway, so you can never win there. Now, obviously there's a lot of research and reviews that have been done about the impact of childhood adversity as one of the major predictors of depression. And the theorists in this area have focused on the importance of these traumas as determinants of the schematic views that individuals develop of the world. In other words, people have had bad things happen to them tend to develop a set of rules that predict that bad things are going to happen in the future. Well, that's the way that the theory would have it. And what this essentially captivates is the idea that there are these enduring effects of early life experience that are bound up by the attitudes and predictions that we make of the world. For example, Briere and Elliott suggested that if childhood sexual abuse increases your risk of adult depression by 4 times. Another important issue that has been looked at for over many years now is the whole issue of parenting style, and the classic type of parenting that's thought to be depressogenic is to have parents who have a high degree of control, which is essentially critical and isn't warm. So essentially it's about maternal overprotection and lack of warmth. But most of that research has been done by, again, asking people about their parents and comparing depressed populations with control populations. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is essentially looking at these measures that we collected in childhood and how they predicted the cognitive schemas in adulthood. Now, these are measures that were taken at the time of the bushfire, and childhood symptoms were in fact a predictor of depression in adulthood. And what we're going to be using for measuring the cognitive schemas in this particular study is Janoff-Bullmann's World Assumption Scale. And this essentially has three scales in it. There's first of all one which looks at benevolence, which is about people's positive views about things that happens. And essentially, if you have a benevolent view, you see that good things happen and misfortune is uncommon. Meaningfulness is a dimension which essentially explains how and why events happen, and people who have high meaningfulness presume that the way that events occur is with some equality. And worthiness of the self obviously relates to a sense of one being able to have control in the world, and that luck is evenly distributed. Janoff-Bullmann, in developing this scale, predicted that obviously children who had lots of traumatic experiences would be more likely to have negative assumptions, and the parents were instrumental in interpreting traumatic experiences and thereby influencing people's adult views. And the essential issue is that not that the experience of trauma is the important thing, but it's how trauma comes to be embedded in a person's conventional predictions about what the world is like. Now, this particular study, unlike most studies, wasn't done in a treatment setting, and essentially it was to do with a sample that we recruited 21 years ago, and it was a school-based sample which was an epidemiological sample, and half of this population had been exposed to a disaster, which allowed us to look at the effect of this disaster exposure on their cognitive schemas. And the aim here was to determine what were the factors that influenced the cognitive schemas, particularly in those who had a lifetime history of major depression when compared with controls, and to examine the extent to which their world assumptions were accounted for by their childhood trauma and the parenting style which they reflected upon in their parents. And our hypothesis obviously was that childhood trauma would be associated as negative adult schemas, and that maternal overprotection and indifference would be associated with these negative cognitive schemas. Now, the original study that I did was one that looked at 8 schools in the southeast of South Australia, and there were roughly 1,500 children in the study. 735 came from a socio-economically matched population, and there was 800 children exposed to the fire, and this data was collected on 3 occasions, 2, 8 and 26 months after the bushfires. And at the time we made a series of measures including family functioning, level of exposure and the children's symptoms. And these were the measures that were taken back in 1983 and 84. And so the first thing that we obviously wanted to look at was, well, what other adversity occurred, what other adverse experiences occurred in childhood, because they also might have impacted upon cognitive schemas, and we were also interested in what were the children's current perceptions of what their parents were like. And we're obviously then interested in what caused their adult disorder. Now, the adverse experiences of childhood scale, which was developed by Fletty and colleagues, and has been extensively used, measures people's childhood trauma in the first 18 years of life, and essentially it has 4 domains. It looks at physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and household dysfunction, which is broken up into substance abuse, mental illness, violence towards the mother, and criminal behaviour. And the parenting style was used the MOPS, developed by Parker and colleagues, and this looks at the perception of parenting in the first 16 years of life, and measures parental indifference, parental overprotection, and parental abuse. And we measured the adult psychiatric outcomes using the CIDI, or the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, and here I'll only be presenting the data about depression. Now, what were the rates of depression in this population, and how did the control group compare with the disaster-exposed group? Well, the first interesting issue is, in fact, there were no differences in the rates of depression between the population who were exposed to the disaster in childhood and the control population. the rates were significant. In the order of 22% of this population had a lifetime history of depression by their mid-20s. So we're not talking about insignificant rates of depression. The striking thing, however, were the rates of other traumatic experiences, both which occurred within the disaster-affected group and within the control population, which was the reason why there weren't statistically significant differences. So there were 173 individuals with a lifetime history of major depression, and that was present at the time of the study in 21%, and 48% had more than one episode. So what about the other adverse experiences that had occurred in childhood in this population as measured by the ACE? Well, again, if we compare the control population and the depressed population, as we would predict, there were significantly higher rates of things like emotional neglect, physical neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and verbal abuse. And generally the rates were between 3 and 4 times greater in the depressed population. I mean, the important observation there is that some of the control group, in fact, didn't get depressed despite these experiences. The other area was in the household dysfunction, where again there was a significantly higher rate of things like mental illness and household substance abuse and domestic violence. So, what were the summary findings here? Well, of the group who were depressed, in fact, I've reversed the percentage here. 50% of the depressed group had, there's a negative here. So 23% of the depressed group had no history of childhood trauma, compared with 50% of the control population. Now, the interesting thing was there was no difference in the rates of divorce and separation in the depressed group from the control group, which I think is a very interesting finding. The area that was particularly striking was the differences in the rates of substance abuse and mental illness in the depressed group. And again, you can see one of the complexities here is the extent to which that might be, in fact, a genetic factor. As I said before, there was no more depression in the disaster-affected group. What about the perceptions of parenting and their relationship to depression? Well, it doesn't matter which of the dimensions of parenting you look at. The depressed group reported more maternal indifference, more maternal overprotection, more maternal abuse, and the same with their fathers. So, generally speaking, you can see that the depressed group are reporting more adversity and worse parenting. Now, the interesting question then is the extent to which this is mediated by their cognitive schemas. Now, this has been shrunk by the slide, by the transition here. But unfortunately, you can't see the numbers here. But if we look at the subscales of benevolence, meaningfulness, and self-worth, there are very little differences. Whilst they're statistically significant in terms of the size effects, they're very small. For example, on the benevolence scale, the depressed group is scoring 34, whereas the control population is scoring 37. So you can see there are very little differences in terms of meaningfulness. Depressed 39, control 41, and self-worth 50 in the depressed group and 56 in the control group. So these are relatively small differences. So what we are then interested in is how does this summate? Well, first of all, parental divorce and separation didn't have any impact on world assumptions, which I think is an interesting issue given the prevalence of divorce and separation in the modern world. However, the traumas that particularly were associated with the world assumptions were in fact household dysfunction, and particularly mental illness and domestic violence against the mother. And once you took those into account, the other factors accounted for very little. So I think this points to the fact that, in fact, a lot of the adversity of childhood is directly mediated through maternal mental illness and domestic violence. So these are the important determinants of cognitive schema in this population. Now, if we try and look at a predictive model, what percentage of the variance of these cognitive schemas are explained by these bad things that had happened? Well, in the depressed sample, 26% of the benevolence factor was actually explained by, interestingly there, the parenting style of the father, not the mother, and emotional neglect. Less of the variance was explained in the control group, and here it was explained by the mother's overprotection. And interestingly, the children who had been physically neglected, in fact, had a more benevolent view of the world, which was a paradoxical finding. When we look at meaningfulness, we find that the depressed sample, we can only explain 17% of the variance, and interestingly here the disaster-affected group had a greater sense of meaningfulness. And I think one of the interesting ideas that in fact Bob Pinus was suggesting me to hear is that maybe these children were in an environment where they actually saw that society worked in providing relief and rescue and intervention, and that in fact that it had a positive view on how the world worked. And interesting, when we looked at the control group, there was very little difference, and it was only accounted in the control population. It was only accounted for by gender, where men had a greater sense of meaningfulness about their lives. And then, if we look at self-worth, interestingly again, this only accounted for 17% of the variance in the depressed group, and it was the fathers in different parenting, not the mothers again. It was the fathers that was important. Whereas in the control population, only 7% of the variance was explained, and this was overprotection by the father and sexual abuse in adulthood. So in summary, this really suggests that in fact relatively little of the variance and the causation of these cognitive schemas was actually explained by adversity in these children once they reached adulthood. Now, to summarise, I mean essentially what this suggests is that obviously the depressed group, as we would have predicted, had more negative world assumptions, but in fact they weren't as large as we would have expected. In fact, the differences were much greater in terms of the adversity in the depressed sample. I think a good news story here is that parental separation, divorce, and even criminal behaviour in the parents didn't seem to predict this, whereas other categories of trauma were associated, particularly those of mental illness in the family and substance abuse. And there were quite different determinants in the depressed and the non-depressed groups. And I think the paradox here is that physical neglect was associated with, in the controls, was associated with greater benevolence, that there was greater meaningfulness in the control group who had experienced the disaster, and that there was a relatively small amount of causation explained in this study. And the issues here, I think, first of all, that fathers, in fact, I think, seem to play a much more important role than we would have anticipated in the follow-up. That really cognitive function doesn't appear to be, the cognitive schemas doesn't appear to be as determined by a stronger determinant as we would have anticipated by these childhood exposures. And that equally there were much smaller differences between the depressed and control group on these measures. And I think this has a very interesting consequence and implications for treatment, because we always tend to presume that if we modify the cognitive schemas, we're going to modify the symptoms. And what we can see is that only a relatively small percentage of the severity of symptoms in adulthood is actually accounted for by these individuals' cognitive schemas, in contrast to there being significantly greater differences in terms of the amounts of adversity they experienced in childhood and the way they perceive their parenting. And I think this begs a number of questions about the importance of other etiological factors, such as the impact of repeated stress and the way that that might interact with genetic vulnerability, and equally might of itself modify an individual's neurobiology. And it would suggest that perhaps the cognitive theories that we use to drive our treatment models aren't as, in fact, quite as potent determinants of symptoms as we might presume. And I think it really leaves us in a situation where we need to be thinking about what might be the other areas that might warrant consideration in terms of our treatment models. So that I think one of the interesting things is that when we do a longitudinal study like this, in fact we don't find the same strength of association as is found in clinical populations that have been more generally studied. And I think we need to have more open minds in terms of the intervention models which we use. Thank you very much.